Baltimore City Council Ways and Means Committee. We're back for fiscal year 2022 budget hearings. Before we begin, colleagues, I'm going to ask all of you to turn your cameras on. Members of the school system and the school board, please turn your cameras on. Members of the school system, please turn your cameras on. Dr. Santelises, can you please let your folks know? You're on mute.
Yes, sir. We will let them know via text, and I will say again what you have said fairly clearly, and that is all members of the school system should have your cameras on now. And Melissa Broom is making sure, who is here with me tonight, is making sure that we get the message directly to folks to have your cameras on.
Thank you. Okay, we are here for City Council Bill 21-0080. That is the ordinance of estimates for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2022, as well as Mayor and City Council Resolution 21-0082, operating budget for the Baltimore City Board of School Commissioners for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2022. My name is Eric Costello. I'm the City Councilman from the 11th District and Chair of the committee. I'm joined in chambers by Councilman Ryan Dorsey, 3rd District member of the committee, and also joined in chambers by Councilwoman Felicia Porter, 10th District. Joining me across the hall is Council President Nick Mosby. We are joined virtually by Councilman Tony Glover, 13th District, Councilman Chris Burnett, 8th District, member of the committee, Councilwoman Odette Ramos, 14th District, Councilman Robert Stokes, 12th District, member of the committee, Council Vice President Sharon Middleton, 6th District, member of the committee, Councilman Zeke Cohen, 1st District, Councilman Mark Conway, 4th District, Councilman Isaac Yitzi Schleifer, 5th District, member of the committee. Joining us on behalf of Mayor Brandon Scott is Natasha Mehew and Nina Themlis. Joining us on behalf of Council President Nick Mosby is Matt Stegman and Nikki Thompson. Marguerite Curran is staff to the committee. And joining us in chambers from the Baltimore City Public School System is Dr. Sonia Santelises, CEO, and Melissa Broom, Senior Director of Government Affairs. Good enough for government. Excellent. She's the main liaison to the city government. Okay, Dr. Santelises, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I believe you are going to in turn pass it over to your board chair to kick things off. I understand that so we're going to do, I'd like to give the board chair 5 minutes to start things off, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Santelises. Dr. Santelises, I understand you have a presentation. I'm going to ask that you keep your presentation to under or about 30 minutes, and then we will get into questions from council members. Dr. Santelises, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Chairman Costello. It's great to be here this evening with you and other members of City Council and the public and my team. I'm going to begin by deferring to Commissioner Chantel Roberts so that she can give the opening, and then I will introduce my team and the city schools team when our Commissioner Roberts finishes. So Commissioner Roberts, I will turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santelises. Thank you, Chairman Costello and members of the Ways and Means Committee. Also, I see President Mosby and Vice President Middleton are present. Thank you as well. I'm Chantel Roberts, Chair of the Operations Committee for the Baltimore City Board of School Commissioners. We find ourselves here again in a virtual setting. However, over a year later, we now have some children back in school buildings learning, unlike this same time last year. The CEO is in person in the council chambers to discuss more details of our fiscal year 22 budget, but I wanted to take this time to thank the City Council for your support, especially during this unprecedented time. As you know, the General Assembly overrode the governor's veto of the blueprint for Maryland's future legislation, which implemented the Kirwan Commission recommendations. The General Assembly also passed legislation that made revisions to the blueprint. This legislation, coupled with additional federal and state funding, will allow the school system to address the challenges that many of our students face while learning virtually. We will be able to provide tutoring services, summer learning opportunities, and other academic interventions for our students. We have launched the Reconnect, Restore, and Reimagine campaign, which will provide our blueprint for instructional supports for the students that found virtual learning difficult and for those students that need stronger supports to succeed. This budget before you clearly delineates priorities based on available funding. But as you know, even with the Kirwan additional dollars to be provided over the next 10 years, it does not allow us to provide everything that we know our children deserve and need. Thank you again for allowing me to have a few comments, and I turn it back over to the CEO.
Thank you very much, Councilman. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Commissioner Roberts, for being here this evening. And I will now take this opportunity to introduce my team as we ready our 30-minute presentation for this evening. With me tonight is our Chief of Staff, Allison Perkins Cohen, and our Chief Financial Officer, Christopher Doherty, who will be presenting with me this evening. I'd also like to recognize the members of my team who are here for additional support if needed. Our Chief Operating Officer, Dr. Lynette Washington, our Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Joan Dabrowski, our Chief of Schools, John Davis, our Chief Human Capital Officer, Jeremy Grant Skinner, and Shayna MacGyver is here standing in for Chief Tina Highcupboard, who oversees communications, enrollment, and engagement. And then finally, our Chief of Accountability and Research, Teresa Jones. I am also joined in council chambers tonight, as you noted, sir, by our Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs, Melissa Broom, and Dewana Starrett, Director of Government Affairs for the board, is also with us virtually. We will try to work within 10 minutes for each of us. I will begin with the first slide for this evening, and I think Chief Doherty is in charge of slides. I think with regards to our presentation this evening, it's important to give some background in terms of where we are with regard to this environment, and just to know what we within city schools consider the foundation of our budget planning. As Commissioner Roberts noted, while we are continuing with the implementation of the blueprint strategies, there is real attention to continued and update health and safety practices, which as we engage with families across Baltimore City, is still foremost on not only our families' mind, but staff mind. We are also, as Commissioner Roberts referenced, planning on how we really will reconnect, restore, and reimagine the educational experience for Baltimore City public school students, not only in this upcoming school year, but also beyond. And then also keeping in mind an increased one-time federal revenue to support school and district operations, while keeping in mind our focus of our alignment with our equity policy and work. Next slide, Chris. One of the things that I'll just reference quickly in this slide before we move, before we move to the next, is this slide is pretty much just outlining our community outreach that we did through Chief High Cupboard's office and across the organization. That was a combination of online surveys, as well as virtual meetings and school-based budget meetings to make sure that we are getting better every year, even though we're still not where we want to be, but we are improving every year and making sure that we're giving communities at the school level and families input into the process. Next slide, Chris. You'll see that through that process of engaging community, there are about 5 major priorities that emerged in feedback from our outreach. You'll see them listed here, and throughout the presentation, we've highlighted in green these priorities to make it easier for both the City Council and the public to see the crosswalk between what we heard from the community in terms of their budget priorities and what you'll see in our budget. Next slide, Chris. You'll see that we continue our alignment with the blueprint, which City Council has heard every year in terms of literacy, wholeness, and leadership. Next slide, Chris. And within each of these areas, this is a good example for if we take a look at literacy, what you'll see here is some samples of some of the literacy focus and where you would find the investment within the city schools budget. We've had a good amount of work done really in a very kind of seed state with our Baltimore secondary literacy improvement community, which is a way that we're really focusing on our adolescent literacy efforts and really driven by on the ground action, research, and practice from teacher leaders. And so we'll be expanding that this year. Be More Me. I was just having a conversation earlier with Councilwoman Porter about our build out of curriculum in the middle grades that really centers the city of Baltimore, the history of Baltimore, and frankly, our present Baltimore as a kind of real connection point with young people, also developed by teachers. So we'll be expanding that because we heard loud and clear that we want students earlier to have these experiences, as well as moving the curriculum up into high school. Another thing that you'll see is that we're going to continue with our 39 literacy coaches deployed to really provide that targeted feedback around literacy instruction and our curriculum investments. So those are some examples of how we're continuing that. You'll see in the bottom left actual examples of some of our additional literacy investment areas for this year. Next slide, Chris. Literacy continued. I think there's just, these are other points, again, if City Council members have questions, but what you'll see here is, again, some of what Commissioner Roberts referenced that we had the opportunity to pilot and want to expand this year, and that is really high impact tutoring. And what we saw was that for example, some of our early grade students who participated 3 days a week or more in early literacy virtual tutoring with tutors primarily from the city of Baltimore who were recruited here from our own Baltimore City college students and others, what we saw was significant growth in those young people who participated in that. And so we'll be expanding that, and then you'll see some of the others that are present, but I am aware of time. So Chris, if we could go to the next slide. Wholeness, and I think it's important here to note that we heard loud and clear from the community, we heard loud and clear from principals, from teachers, that really the investment that we're going to need to make in the expansion and maintaining our wholeness specialists, our social emotional learning. We heard, for example, from a number of teachers and school-based educators that the work that our team did in incorporating social emotional learning supports this year in the virtual space really paid off dividends in terms of being able to support our young people, not just academically, but frankly, in managing what it means to build community, be part of community in a real trying time. And then overwhelmingly, mental health services is another area I would draw your attention to, because again, that aligns very clearly and strongly with what we heard from the community, as well as what we heard from our own team. Again, you'll see mentoring, student advising, and loud and clear. We have a very heavy focus on school culture as we re-enter into school, back into physical school buildings more this coming fall. And again, you'll see some of the investments, but more happy to take questions on that as we proceed. Next slide, Chris. I also think that it's important because we know that City Council has been, I think, very, very active in making sure that we are expanding work-based learning, career technology, education, reimagining that. All of that work we're beginning to see really yield dividends and was yielding dividends prior to the pandemic. What we've heard from young people is, having been away from school buildings for over a year and a half, in many cases, they want more connections to the real world of work. And so where we have seen success, we are not only continuing in this regard, but you will see both now as well as with future federal funds. And I know we'll be coming back to City Council to update you on that. We are going to really be continuing to invest in that, as well as some of the 9th grade on track to graduation work that we've been able to present to you earlier this year. Next slide, Chris, before I turn it over, I think, to Allison. You'll see the third area with regards to leadership, that we are continuing to actually really use and leverage our high-performing distinguished principals to really go, frankly, beyond just their own schools, but to impact and inform the entire district as we really expand the notion of leadership beyond just who might officially be sitting on the cabinet or have 3 letters next to their name, but that actually the belief that leaders are throughout the organization, regardless of where you sit. So what you'll see here is we're building on some of our early success and increasing the numbers of Black teachers. We're increasing our opportunity culture schools, where we've seen real shifts in how those school cultures are working, particularly from a teacher and school leader standpoint. And then again, you'll see some of the investments in principal pipeline and teacher recruitment as well. Next slide. And without further ado, because I am at the end of my 10 minutes, I'm going to turn it over now to Chief of Staff, Allison Perkins Cohen, to walk us through some of the additional federal and state dollars that have come forward, frankly, down to the school system as a result of increased investments to address some of the expenses and ongoing challenges of navigating absolutely our health crisis, but also, I would say, some of the racial unrest we have experienced, as well as the economic challenges that are impacting families. So Chief Perkins Cohen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. You were exactly on time. So you were right on, kept us right on pace. So I'll try to keep us on pace too, or maybe even speed up a little bit so that Chris has ample time. So I want to go through the different federal grants first. So remember that this is an unusual year. And so we have this influx of federal dollars that has come in, different stages. These are one-time funds. It's important to remember. They are important to help us deal with the immediate situation we've had to deal with regards to the pandemic. And then also one thing that's important to remember is that unlike other districts, a lot of these funds are also just helping us catch up. They're helping us put things in place that frankly should have been in place before, but are necessary now in a pandemic. So those are 2 important things to remember about these funds. So with ESSER 1, this first group of this first grant we received is through September 30th, 2022. This was the first one we received. One key investment that we've had to make there is for food services support. Our food service workers we're out providing food to the communities immediately when schools close down. Of course, communities are very dependent on schools as a food source, and so when schools closed, that was very disruptive to families, or it could have been. But our cafeteria staff was out feeding their communities immediately when schools closed. Our food services are paid for through an enterprise fund that is paid for by the number of meals served. On a typical school day, we serve somewhere between 90 and 100,000 meals a day. When the schools closed, that went down to more like 15 or 20,000 meals. So that's a huge hit to the revenue for that fund. And so we were able to put some of the costs of folks who weren't working on this grant, as well as some of the equipment costs and so on this grant to help defray that impact. Also, we put funds in there for some of the device distribution that we needed to do. That was immediately, we needed to get devices for our students. City Council helped with that as well. There was a $3 million grant from City Council that helped pay for that. But you'll see there's $14 million here on this grant for devices, as well as Wi-Fi for students. So Chief High Hubbard is here. She did a lot of critical work to make sure that we were providing internet access to our students, and that was an expense on this grant, as well as other supports like signage to help help people social distance in schools and understand the health screening, and re-engagement efforts to bring students back who we weren't connecting with effectively. Chris? Next slide. So ESSER 2, this grant goes through September 30th of 2023. This grant, one key piece of investment we put in here is, again, we had a real priority of getting as many people back as quickly as possible. We started that work in the summer. We had in-person learning last summer. We staggered and learned from our own experience and other districts that staggering that implementation of having more people in person was really effective. But come March, as we started bringing back all schools, all grades, and an important piece of that was the COVID testing. So the COVID testing is up and running. We're doing weekly symptomatic testing, asymptomatic testing for staff and students, as well as we have symptomatic testing through our partnership with the University of Maryland Medical System. That has been hugely helpful and has proven our schools to be very safe places. Our elementary grade prevalence rate for COVID is now at 0.29%. So it is a very safe place to be. And our high schools, I don't know the current rate, but last I knew it was 0.7%. So it's also very low. We also had to do some special ed recovery support to help make sure that we're keeping our special ed students on track. And then we bought, again, if you look on the left-hand side, some of the things we bought, we worked on indoor air quality. So kudos to Chief Washington, who's here, and the kind of really, I think, leading work that they did to upgrade the air quality and have MERV 13 filters in place. We added additional custodians. There was an area, again, on the catch-up theme. This is an area where over years with tight and flat or cut budgets, we cut custodians. We prioritized classrooms. We prioritized teaching. We prioritized enrichment as much as we could. And we increased over time the amount of square footage we were expecting custodians to cover because we couldn't afford enough custodians, frankly. So we put some custodians back when it was really important to make sure surfaces were clean. And then Wi-Fi for students, you'll see, is another key line here. And then switches and wireless infrastructure, another catch-up provision. Our schools don't have Wi-Fi throughout them. So we had to make an investment here that other school districts did not. So ESSER 3, this is the amount of money that we just got recently. This is 3-year money through September 30th, 2024. This is what we're working to do extensive engagement with the community to get input from them on what we should be investing in here. So we've got Chief Davis and Chief Dabrowski here who are leading the effort of the development of the plan, and then Chief Jones and Chief High Hubbard, who both are helping leading the engagement efforts. And so many of you, thank you, participated in the sessions we had in May to get input from folks. And then we'll go to the next slide because I think we talked about the timeline in the next slide. Oh, these are the key areas: literacy, math, secondary innovation, wholeness, virtual learning, virtual school, staff well-being, and communication and engagement. The green areas, again, are ones that we heard from the community were important. So timeline next, I think. So in terms of the timeline, we should be releasing a draft, a kind of high-level draft summary plan in the next week or so, and then we'll also be developing that, getting feedback on that, and developing that into a final plan later in the summer. Next slide. So just some other, again, key investments that we made in the general funds budget this year. So I talked earlier about Dr. Washington's work on the MERV 13 filters and air purifiers so that all of our buildings meet ASHRAE standards. We also have been doing the COVID screening test that I talked about. And then we also created this on-call kind of a team of custodians who's available to help support schools meet their cleaning standards. And then I'm trying to think, and then PPE has been, of course, an expense throughout all this that we've had to keep moving. Next slide. So technology investments, we've talked about this a lot, the switches, the access points for buildings, and so that's an ongoing investment. Next slide. And then other key areas of investment. So again, in a time like this, we're also trying to really hold close to our priorities that we've already identified. So equity is an area we're continuing to invest in. I think a lot of folks have wanted to know when the equity work is getting to the schools. And Dr. Durant, who's been just expertly leading this work, started with higher level trainings for board members, for cabinet members, for executive directors, for principals. And now those folks who have been trained are forming the action teams in schools. We'll start seeing this school by school plans being developed and implemented. We've done a lot of work on enrollment choice and transfer that we'll continue to work on to make sure that options are clear and accessible to parents, and the information is accessible to parents. We're trying to catch up on translation and interpretation services to make sure that our multilingual families have access to the information they need. Next slide. And then, we're trying to, again, continue to invest in bus drivers and bus aides, and to make sure that we are not as dependent on contractors as we have been, because our own buses and transportation and bus drivers are sometimes more reliable. And so we're trying to expand that fleet slowly over time to make investments in that. We also know we're switching to Kerwin, which is a very different way of managing our resources. So we're trying to make sure that we're going to have resources there to help us make that shift, which in a very different way we've to fund schools. And then things like key priorities, like making sure that we're really, as we're looking for procuring services, that we're really investing in MBE, WBE support to make sure that we're considering that when we're selecting providers, and then supporting our growing ESOL population, and continuing to expand the work that Chief Hike Hubbard has done on family and community engagement to make sure we're really developing the capacity of our schools to engage their families. And that's why Ms. McIver is here tonight to speak about that. I think that's over to you, Chris. Yes.
Thank you. I'm unmuting myself, and my name is Chris Doherty, and I'm the Chief of the Finance Office, and I will be walking you through some of the numbers in these slides. I will try to keep it speedy, as we want to leave time for questions, as Mr. Chairman indicated. As we know, the most important part in funding is enrollment. Enrollment drives funding. It drives it everywhere. And so this four-year graph shows a slight downward trend in our enrollment figures from FY21 to FY22, which is the period we're about to enter into, FY22. We did experience a slight drop. So we really think we are leveling off. There was nothing normal at all about FY21 in any measure, and we were down in number of eligible students by less than 1%. But nevertheless, the 73,067 students, as far as funded enrollment, has a ripple effect across all of our funding, as we know, and that's why we start with the number of children we have. A previous question came up, so I did want to say, and of course, this is all in the leave behind as well, but there are two quick things for the group, and that is, although our enrollment dipped a bit, 0.6% dip, we did receive a hold harmless provision by the state, and which was a good thing. So it was good that our dip in enrollment was not as marked as we had been prepared for in such a different year, and also it was lower than it has been in recent years. Nevertheless, that would have otherwise triggered a dip in funding, but the state of Maryland did provide a hold harmless provision, which essentially kept the state level flat. So here, in a previous question that we got, the district is funded overwhelmingly by, of course, the state and the city, to the tune of, combined between the state and, of course, our home city of Baltimore, we get 97.5% of our funding, based entirely on the student enrollment that we mentioned. Now, when we are held harmless, we're held harmless at a district level. It does occur that on a school-to-school basis, when enrollments either grow or dip, there is an unavoidable process that we go through, and a very necessary process, where on a school-by-school basis, we work with the schools, determine whether there's increased or decreased enrollment, and work from there. So I point that out to say that sometimes when members think of being held harmless, they think it applies to each and every building, and that isn't the case. It is at the district level. And we do, as part of our annual budget process, we work with schools specifically to address ups and downs in enrollment and what that means, all importantly, for programming. Now, and I've mentioned that in the this slide. Now, at the highest level, our total revenue allocation, and this is separate from what Chief Perkins-Cohen and Dr. Sanalisis mentioned with the kind of once-in-a-lifetime set of federal funds that are alternately called CARES or ARP or ESSER. This is our standard budget, which doesn't factor in the numbers that we saw in previous slides, and that is our general fund budget this year is 1.182 billion, a slight uptick from last year. Our special grant funds are just under 156 million. Special grant funds are overwhelmingly federal funds, but also some state funds. Those are the grant funds you typically refer to by their title: Title I, Title II, Title III, IV, IDEA, and the like. And enterprise funds are the funds that we use for our food and nutrition service, where we provide to all of our students free of charge as a community eligible provision district. When we're up and running in a normal year, which we're eager to get back to, we serve between 90 and 100,000 meals a day to our children, and we get reimbursed for that from the USDA. And the general size of an operation that big has separate funding, separate rules, and that comes in at $55.5 million or so. Add those three big buckets together, and you get our overall total revenue allocation for FY22 of 1.393 billion, which again, on a year-to-year basis, is up by less than 1%, driven again primarily by number of students and some other factors. A quick double click, and I am conscious of time, but when, as I said, 97.5% of our funding is from the state and the city. So we have the other categories in there for the completeness of the record, but the real story is that our state revenue of 857 million has stayed the same, held harmless. There are timing differences that make relatively small non-material changes, but it's essentially flat. And our second largest, 25% of our overall budget comes from you all, of course, and that has gone from 287.3 million to 295.1 million, which again is about 25% of our overall general fund. And as council members know, that's driven by a rather elaborate formula that has to do with number of students, and then also within the student body, whether a student belongs to a particular group or one or more groups, and it goes through the formula, and that's what drives these things. I won't belabor the other categories. They add up to 2.5%, as important as they are. I do think looking at this side by side of the single biggest, the state one, is at least worth a glance. Although we will, we mentioned that we're at 857 million from one year to the next. There are lots of ups and downs within the subcategories that make up the state revenue. The foundation program is what we will hear and what you hear as the base per pupil amount. That's the single biggest subcategory, which comes in at about $350 million. And then after that, you add in things, again, rather elaborate state-driven formula that takes into account important elements like levels of poverty, transportation, special education, and the like. And the takeaway from this slide is happily from FY21 to FY22, we've remained flat. And there were lots of planning periods where during this FY21, it was not at all clear that that was going to be the case. So we are very grateful that our two biggest contributors have stayed the same and slightly increased. That's making all the difference. Again, using the double click method of the special grants that I mentioned, just to give a sense of what those are. As mentioned, they're mainly federal and also some state, but this gives members a view of what I mentioned as far as what the titles are. The biggest one is Title I Part A, coming in at $56 million. And then the rest all add up to 109 million, plus the state funds make the difference to just under 156. A word here on Kerwin. The funds we just talked about, albeit quickly, were unrestricted funds. We also have restricted funds, some of which are known by their names, Concentrations of Poverty Grants, CPG, and you see some of those here. FY22, importantly, is this upcoming year. It's the year Kerwin doesn't begin to kick in full force until FY23. There is one program that is Kerwin, and that's the second one here, the Concentrations of Poverty per Pupil grant, to the tune of 22 million. The other restricted grants that we benefit from have been labeled Bridge to Kerwin, and that's exactly what they are. As we transition to a Kerwin environment, these have given us similar funds, again, to make the bridge to Kerwin, and these give you a flavor of what they are. The Kerwin, so this slide is meant to say that in FY22, the $22 million is Kerwin funding, but then it's going to significantly increase in the out years, from 236 million in FY23 to an estimated amount of 588 by 2030. To say those are significant is an understatement, and lots of planning and incorporation is underway. But those, as the numbers person, those are the current estimates of the size of the annual Kerwin amounts. I'll gain some time here because I think this is pretty well known. It's just side by side on our Title I, which again is driven by students and poverty. Last, for the fullness of the record, in addition to the general funds, we have the enterprise fund, which I mentioned is our food and nutrition services, which is in the neighborhood of $55 million a year. And also fund balance. As council members know, fund balance is what's used sometimes, or quite often the amount changes, but fund balance is used to make contributions to the general fund for certain items. And this is a look at our last 3 years of fund balance contribution, which it dipped in FY21. It did go up slightly for FY22, but again, quite within the historical norm. I will try to gain time here. I can't see any faces, but I do remember what Councilman Costello said about time. One of the things we're most focused on is within our overall budget, how much of that goes to schools and how much of that is spent for schools. So if there's one dividing that we have to talk about, and we always keep an eye on it, it's of the general fund number that you saw a few slides ago, the 1.182 billion. How much of that is sent to the schools for use at the school level, or allocated centrally at the central office, but spent on behalf of schools? And that our overall amount is in the neighborhood of, well, it's not the neighborhood, it's 84%. So 84% of our 1.182 billion is either sent out to our schools for use by the school leaders and the building people, or it's something that we handle at Central, but very explicitly on behalf of students. The 803 here that you see in direct school allocations is made up of different categories. Suffice it to say, although it's here and they all add up, the FSF traditional that's our acronym for Fair Student Funding. Our district is very proud of how the dollars follow the student, and we give a lot of school-based decision-making to the principals and to the school personnel. So a very large chunk of the overall funds are Fair Student Funding funds that are determined and allocated at the school level. We have locked and unlocked positions, which, not to get into it too deeply, but there are certain things that certain positions that each school needs. Every school needs a principal. That's a locked position. So we handle that at the district level. There are certain special education roles that are handled from the district. But the net effect is these categories are meant to give as much flexibility as possible and as much support as possible to our school-based folks when things are more easily handled at a central level. And that goes into the 803 million that you saw as school-directed funds. The charter schools, very briefly, 20% of our children are in charter schools. We're very proud of that. The charter school formula is an entirely different formula, and it's probably not worth getting into too much of it now. But what is important is to say the charter schools do get more per pupil. At the same time, the traditional schools get a lower base per pupil, but they get a lot more services provided to them. But the fact is, as far as the strict per pupil, charter schools you see are at 92.34, and our traditional schools are at 55.68. But then you get into a wide range of services that are delivered, and it evens out. This is essentially showing flat at the district office allocation. If you look at the last line, you see it goes from just under 379 million to just under 379.5 million, which is about right. There will be dips and slight increases per office, but I think the takeaway here is that the district office allocations are essentially flat. The reason why this slide is, this is the pie chart version of what I mentioned, that between 83 and 84% of our funds either go to the schools for them to do as they deem appropriate, or spent on schools by the district office. And when we say district office, and we say some of that is spent at the district office, that doesn't mean, what we take pains to point out is some of that is, of course, for hardworking district office staff, but a significant chunk of that is also for students. Like here, for example, it's spent centrally, but we will have special ed consultants, the nursing contracts, other things like preventative maintenance. Schools don't want to have to do all those things themselves. As much as they like decentralized decision making, there are a whole host of things that are better treated centrally, and that's what drives the logic, and that's why we do it the way we do. And finally, but we do keep very close track of what percentage of our overall budget that we've been entrusted with goes to central office personnel, of which we're all proud members, and it's about 6%. And that amount is something we keep an eye on to make sure that it stays at a very lean percentage. So I hope, Chairman Costello, that we hit our numbers, so to speak, with the time, and I turn it back to you or to Dr. Santelises.
Thank you very much. If you could take the presentation down, please.
Of course.
Okay. We're going to get into questions here in a moment. A couple reminders for colleagues. Number one, we're going to strictly enforce the 2-question rule. We'll go in order, and there will be multiple rounds. I'm certain of that. and we'll go in the order that we select from the first round. Number two, we're not going to be doing speeches tonight. So I'm going to ask council members to get directly to their questions. And I'm asking to not have speeches on the floor. We all care very much about the school system. We all care very much about our children and the folks who work every day to teach. And Dr. Santelises and her team understand that, and they understand our concerns. And what we're here to do tonight is to not make speeches, but to hear them justify their budget and talk about the things that they're doing and the challenges that they're facing and how the city of Baltimore and the city council can be more supportive of their efforts. So with that, I'm going to start off with Council President Mosby. I'm going to go to Council Vice President Middleton, and then I'll go through committee members first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my two questions are very quick and simple. This first question derived from a group of parents that wanted some answers. And so I'm going to pose the question so I know how to explain this to them. But we know that we have libraries in our schools, and there's some schools that are still not part of the, I guess, 21st century construction. And we know that libraries are common spaces, for community meetings, and they try to make them inviting and just motivational. And so is that part of the principal's obligation to keep the maintenance and beautification of that particular library, or can they solicit help from your utilities maintenance staff?
No, thank you, Councilwoman Middleton. What I would say is, generally speaking, yes, principals oversee what the overall running and state of the library is, but very forthrightly, the funding to do that is minimal. And I think we just need to be straightforward about that. And so we have worked with Heart of America. We've worked with other organizations. Clearly, Weinberg has had a long-standing investment in libraries in Baltimore City Public Schools, but we have been very reliant on outside partners to help maintain, because when we look at what the capital budget is for city schools, and I know you're aware of this, as are many members of City Council, we are woefully under what other districts receive, frankly, from their from their county or their city. And so, because our rates are so low, while yes, I can say that it is principals, in fairness to them, they don't have the kind of resources in their budget to maintain libraries that schools in other counties do.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And my second question, we just earlier today, we had Baltimore City Recreation and Parks, and they basically announced a shortage of lifeguards in our pools in high school. And of course, it dawned on me, hey, the school system needs to know this, because I remember growing up that, in high school, 16, 17, 18-year-olds were trained to have those summer jobs as lifeguards. So would it be a possibility to connect with Director Moore to maybe try to get together some kind of program? Do we have some indoor pools in some of our schools?
Very few, Councilwoman. We have very few, and but where we do have, like for example, at Vivian T, our principal there, has been very diligent in her advocacy to keep their indoor pool going. She has an active, an active program there. But I, again, would be remiss if I were to, say that every high school has that program. And it goes back to what compounded underfunding does over
Right.
time, that the maintenance of pools has become increasingly more expensive. That being said, though, certainly, Councilwoman, we could absolutely work with Director Moore. And for those places where we do have those programs, and we have some schools that have been very creative and have partnered with the Y or partnered with other places, we can help them try to make that contact, but it's not nearly as widespread as it might, as you might remember, for example, when you were in school.
So rec and parks, they do have aquatic centers, and most of them have been renovated, and then we have a fairly brand new one at Cahill. So I just foresee somehow, if you can do that connect in partnership, it's another lifeline to keep our students active and motivated and directed. And then it's focusing them on a nice summer job. And those
No,
are things
absolutely.
that we had in the past. And I just see this as another good opportunity. So please connect with Director Moore, and because he's just, they're in dire need of a pipeline for lifeguards.
Sure. No, we absolutely will reach out.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Vice Chairman Dorsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Centelisis and everybody. In the grand scheme of the level of underfunding that the school faces and the level of programming we wish schools had, the level of adequacy that we would hope, ideally meet, this is a small concern, but it's one I've raised before because it's been raised to me a number of times particularly by administrators at traditional public schools, and is the date of the last count for the year to distribute funding to schools based on the number of students that they have enrolled, and particularly over the assertion that certain schools have a higher propensity to let certain students go just after that last count.
Yes.
Particularly charter schools, where the students end up in traditional public schools that don't have the luxury of being able to not take them in, but that the funding for that student stays with the charter school that dismissed them just after the last count, and none of that funding is then transferred to the traditional school that the student ends up in, creating a deeper disparity between the schools. And I've asked here in years past if it wouldn't make sense for there to be some further reserve of funding beyond what has been for some time the final count for yet some other later count. Is this something, I've asked before, is this something that we've considered? I've asked before, is this something that's possible? And I'm asking those questions again.
Sure. No, thank you, Councilman Dorsey. And what I would say is actually prior to March of last year, we actually had begun tracking which schools, because it's one thing for people to say, right, this is happening. We wanted to actually begin tracking the data, frankly, not just from charter to traditional, but frankly, from traditional to traditional, because that, what you have described, I absolutely have heard, others have heard. And so one of the things that Chief High Cupboard and her team had begun to do is actually track via numbers and data, not just going on kind of what folks are saying. Where are we seeing the trends of that quote push out? So one, yes, it is possible. I would say there's a couple of things that we have talked about doing, and one has been actually doing more upfront replacement of dollars, as you have, as you've described, not waiting till the entire next school year to right size that. But frankly, on the other side is holding the schools that are pushing students out accountable for the push out post the date. I think we need both on either end. And we had begun tracking that data if in far more earnest at the beginning of the 2020-21 school year. Are we in 2021? Yes, I'm sorry. So it's 1920 school year. And pandemic hit in March, and then kind of things got, tipped around. But I will tell you that is data that we actually have started collecting and monitoring, so that on both ends. So it's not that it's just, can we give money to the schools that are receiving those students, but how do we also hold the schools that are, whether they're charter or traditional, that are pushing students out conveniently within a week or two after that deadline, actually begin tracking and have some conversations about the difference in kind of count pre that date and count after that date. And we've also had just discussions again on how we further support schools that are getting like an influx of, say, 30 students with IEPs in February, long after the budget cycle, right? How do we do some of that piecing together? And we are not lumping, but we're integrating those discussions with also our small school discussions, because we're seeing the same thing there. That it's one thing to say we have site-based decision making. It's another thing to say, do you actually have the resources to make the decisions based on when students are coming in? So I'm actually happy to be able to tell you we're monitoring that data far more closely than we were when, the first time that you asked.
That is certainly inspiring to hear. It's great to hear that that we're moving in that direction. I just want to ask if you can talk about how this budget year is going to see an expansion in opportunity for arts education across the district.
No, and thank you for that question. So I think one of the things that has been really beneficial for us is actually having a city schools arts plan that was developed in collaboration with the arts community here in Baltimore. And it really has, frankly, served a real grounding purpose. So a real life example from some of our first budget meetings was we had a timing issue with when we were going to receive additional funds from the state for the concentration of poverty dollars that that Chief Doherty referenced earlier, because schools did not know, and it was an internal kind of communication, miscommunication. Schools began, a certain number of schools began cutting, for example, some of their more recent arts hires. Well, one of the things that we did, again, because we have a plan, we know where we want to be in terms of increasing our investment first in arts faculty and, frankly, arts opportunities connected with arts faculty. It was an alarm, right? Because we shouldn't be cutting. So we immediately, and again, it was raised as part of a community budget hearing. And so in terms of emphasizing why it's good to have community budget hearings, we had some of our arts advocates raise that issue. It was a flag because we do go by our arts plan. And so we actually did that correct before we even got to, the next stage in the process. So I'm pleased to see, pleased to be able to report that we don't have any declines in arts faculty. And then two, one of the things that has also come up within our reconnect and reimagine planning has really been the kind of loud and clear message that arts integration and art support is going to be key for young people who are reconnecting, who have been out of school buildings, out of, frankly, school community for a long time. And so what we are looking at now, and I don't have kind of a definitive answer for you, but one of the things that we're doing now as we look in that stage of the ESSER planning is, are there investments we can make kind of in a front-loading way in anticipation of when Kerwin becomes fully online, according to the timeline that the Chief Doherty described earlier. So I would say we're doing two things. We're, one, making sure that we're not falling below the targets that are outlined in the jointly, written and agreed upon plan that we have for city schools. And two, we're looking for how the infusion of the one-time dollars might be able to serve as more of a bridge to when Kerwin dollars come on board, and maybe we're able to actually accelerate what's in the arts plan. And more than happy to get you a copy of that plan so that you'll be able, you and other council members can familiarize yourself with really what our kind of agreed upon benchmarks and targets are with regards to the expansion of support for arts education and arts.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing more about how the system is going to be using one-time dollars across the board. And I hope that we can share some of the data and information about the expulsions and transfers as that data is collected in the, perhaps in the year ahead.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Stokes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam CEO, how you doing? First question is, will there be additional funding for additional social workers to address issues related to general population students who may have mental health stress due to COVID-19? And I'm not particularly talking about the social workers for the IEP. I'm talking about just for the general population.
Yes, no, thank you, Councilman Stokes. So just by way of context and reminder, city schools actually pre-COVID made the commitment 2 budget cycles ago that we would make sure that every school had a minimum of 1 full-time social worker in every school. We got great feedback from school leaders about that investment. And that was a shift in existing dollars because we to know, understand, and have heard of the great need around increased social worker support so that our young people have access to mental health support. I would say moving forward, one of the things that we're discussing again now is, given that we have one-time dollars and that there is not currently a significant increase long-term to dollars, what we are looking at now is the increase in social work support that we can actually put in place within the next 2.5 years of the federal funding. And so, yes, I would look to that as a place where we will have that kind of short-term support. I think the long-term question, though, and one of the things that I'm charged with, by the board is not necessarily going out and hiring lots of people that we then have to release in 2 years when funding goes away. So part of what we are working on now as part of our planning is how can we strategically add, again, social work support in a way that is meaningful and immediate, knowing that we are coming out of like unprecedented challenge for young people, and the mental health need has been well documented across the country. We will have those in place, and we will also need to plan in a way and increase in a way that we are fiscally responsible with regards to long-term funding needs. So that's why a lot of the work we're doing is really saying, how are we using dollars like concentration of poverty dollars and other sources for some of that long-term support.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, can that be a request that once that process is in place, that the council, Dr. Sandalisa, make sure we get that information?
Yes, Councilman. Can you summarize that request for me in 1 sentence, please?
The funding piece for additional social workers, how that look, and I know you said you don't want to have it for 2 years and then you got to lay people off. Will the funding be in place for those additional social workers, but not for 2 years, but more continuous funding, so we don't bring in those persons for 2 years and then they're gone. So more funding, but permanent funding for additional social workers. Am I-
Dr. Santelises, can you summarize the request for me as you understand it, please?
Sure. So the request, as I understand it, Chairman, is that we would report back what the plan for increased social work support would be, and outlining within that update the timeline and funding sources for that support, so that the city council and public are very clear about what would be long-term investment as opposed to short-term investment.
What's a reasonable time frame for you providing that?
So we are in the middle of our, we are just getting ready within the next week or so to release our draft reimagine and recovery planning in a week, and our final plan is scheduled to be in place by the end of July. So we would be able to get back to City Council around that same time.
Around July?
Yes, around the end of July, sir.
End of July, 2 months. Councilman Stokes, is that acceptable? 2 months?
Yes, it is.
Absolutely. Excellent. Nina, can you please add that to the list? Thank you.
And I have
Councilman
one
Stokes.
question. Will there be funding to support reading specialists to work with students who struggle with reading? Because we know that probably was an issue even before the pandemic. So that's my question.
Sure. And so, Councilman Stokes, what I would do first is just cite the place within our budget where you'll see over the last 2 to 3 years, we've made increased investment in literacy coaches in schools with not just increased need, but also schools that have said they want to do a deep dive in literacy. So we have already begun that commitment, even without increased funding from either the state, the city, or the federal government. To add to that, I think what you will see in our planning that I also referenced earlier is the investment that we've already made beginning last year with the arrival of the first round of ESSER funds in literacy tutoring, particularly for those young people in the early and most vulnerable grades, but also those students who still need additional support in the upper grades. And again, what we are seeing is where we can get young people for 3 sessions a week. We are seeing the increases, and actually some of our data that we received from Amplify showed that Baltimore City public schools were moving 3 times the national rate of young people out of the lowest reading category into the next reading category. So a lot of that is connected to the amount of time young people are spending in tutoring. But when we do, Baltimore City schools have shown that we actually are exceeding the national rate of improving student reading. So those are where you would see the investments in this budget.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you, Dr. Santelises and your team this evening. Thank you for joining us. So I wanted to talk about a issue that's been brought to my attention around the school system's participation in the Handle with Care partnership. And for colleagues, that partnership is sort of a collaborative effort with the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention, and it's between Baltimore City schools, school police, health department, child abuse center, and Baltimore Police Department. And essentially what it's supposed to be is that when a child is exposed to some sort of trauma or violence in their home or neighborhood, there's supposed to be a coordinated response to let the teachers know, let the school know what's going on, and provide sort of a continuum of care. I was sent data that showed over the last 18 months that only 20 youth in Baltimore City were referred through that program, which would put us at the lowest participation level among all the participating counties. Can you talk about what the hangups are with that particular initiative? Because my concern is the level of trauma and violence that we have in the city. That 20 students and the entire system seems pretty inadequate in participation in that program.
Yes, no, and thank you for the question, Councilman. We might have someone who's here with us tonight who'd be able to speak more specifically. But what I would say is, one, I'd actually have to look at the data for that specific program. But one of the things that Mayor Scott and I have had discussions about already is the fact that we actually knew we would have underrepresentation of and under-identification of students for the kinds of supports that we are able to connect young people to when we actually see them in person. And frankly, that is happening in urban and rural school districts all across the country as a result of it. So I cannot speak specifically to the data point that you are referencing. In order to be prepared, I'd have to actually see the same data that you're looking at, and more than happy to take a look at that and circle back. But I will tell you, like I said, both the mayor and I have had discussions about the need to have really robust processes in place when young people return to schools, and really making those connections as part of the overall strategy of supporting youth and children. But I would actually not want to speak randomly to data that I haven't seen, but more than happy to get back to you on that, Councilman.
I would definitely like to meet and chat about it. I think it's a missed opportunity potentially. And again, maybe there's barriers or partners that need to be brought to the table. But yes, let's start with the conversation there, because I think when I was looking, there's a website that you can sort of compare our jurisdiction to others, and it wasn't looking too good for us compared to several other counties. So just wanted to make sure that we're taking advantage of that initiative. Seems like a good one that could really help navigate the issue of trauma among the student body of Baltimore City schools. The second question I had, and this is just broadly speaking, are there, because I've seen this in both the public health world and just sort of national conversations around returning to work, are there concerns or things that you are all monitoring around, I guess, is there's a greater reopening in the fall schedule? Are there going to be enough teachers and staff to be able to handle that? I know that there's a lot of people in all fields, particularly public health and education, that are in that sort of frontline work, reluctant to come back. Are there concerns or red flags that you all are seeing with that for the fall?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I will do is ask Chief Grant Skinner to just give you a general overview of where we stand now with regards to, intentions of staff. Right now, we're not seeing drop off in with regard to teachers who are going to who are showing interest in teaching this summer and working this summer. But I think Chief Grant Skinner would be able to speak more directly to some of your questions in terms of the data. I will say this, that, to your first question, we have, I communicated probably either last board meeting and before our intention, because we have been on a steady pace since last summer, to make sure that we are opening wisely. We demonstrated that we can do that. And so we've communicated to Baltimore City public school families that we will be offering full-time, in-person, 5-day-a-week schooling at all schools come this fall. And we will have a minimal virtual option for families who might still seek that. But it will be very different than what it was this year, and everything is gearing towards a full reopening of school. But Chief Grant Skinner, did you want to add something with regard to the staffing patterns and what you're seeing thus far in our data, please?
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Sanfelice. So I will just share two points. One is when we look at the number of staff members who've indicated an intent not to return next year, which is data we collect every spring. It is very similar to a typical school year. This is actually on the heels of a year where very few staff members chose to leave the district compared to a typical year in the middle of the pandemic this past year. So we're not seeing any projection of a greater need than any other year. The second thing I'll share is because we took a phased approach to gradual reopening over the course of the year, we got to a point by the end of the year where the vast majority of our staff members already had returned to work in person. And there were a very small number of our teachers and other staff who sought and needed and were granted accommodations allowing them not to return. And we expect in the fall that number will be even more low. So those are a couple of points just to emphasize what Dr. Sanfelice shared, that we're not anticipating any significant challenge there.
Thank you, Chief Grant Skinner. Councilman, does that answer your question?
Yep. Thank you. I have a couple more, but I'll wait my turn. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Schleifer is off. Councilwoman McCray, are you on? Okay, we'll now jump over to non-committee members. Councilwoman Porter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I just have a few questions. One as a follow-up from, I believe it was Councilman Stokes, his informational hearing related to COVID-19 in the school systems. One of the things that I brought up was bathrooms and sanitation as relates to, bathroom sanitation as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic. My two high schools in my district had significant challenges related to the state of their public facilities, i.e. their bathrooms, their water fountain. I wanted to know, are you all going to be reallocating, or have you all allocated anything in the capital budget related to getting those schools, those sanitation areas, those bathrooms in the correct form, so that when students return to school, they have top-notch facilities related to public health?
No, thank you, Councilwoman Porter. So one of the things that I will say, and Chief Dr. Washington can speak to this in more detail, one of the things that we definitely did during the last year was invested far more central resources into, and I think Chief Perkins Cohen referenced this in her time presenting, that we did invest far more significant centralized resources into custodial staff, increasing the number of custodial staff within our standard operating procedures. We had a number of cleaning protocols that we put in place, particularly because of the health challenges, and even when even when the CDC and other health agencies released data and information on the virus that frankly it is not transported. It's not transmitted through touch. We never abated in our cleaning protocols that we had. So we've been pretty consistent in that, and we have had investments. So I think if the question is around the cleaning, then we would want to take a look at those particular schools and work with Chief Davis to see what might it be at those two schools. We actually had feedback from a number of schools and families that buildings were notably cleaner when young people returned, and that the investment in the additional custodial support was evident. That does not mean that in every case, and so more than happy to dig deeply. If it is a matter of actually renovating the bathroom, I think that to your point, is a capital dollars question, and where we are with that. And what does that look like? We know that we have needs within bathrooms. We know that the 21st century work does address it in some schools, but certainly not all. And bathrooms are a place, very much like library space and everything else, that when, our capital budget is maybe a sixth of what Baltimore County's is, in terms of that, it does mean that we have definite, needs in school bathrooms. So I think one of the first things we need to do is isolate, is this kind of a maintenance question that we need to address through additional custodial support, or is it a facilities question, in which case we would need to evaluate that. And I believe Dr. Washington can talk a little bit about even some of the evaluation we've done already throughout all of our schools around the state of bathrooms in the state, for the need for increased investment, increased in capital investment in bathrooms. But Dr. Washington, did you want to add to that, ma'am?
Yeah. Yeah, and so thank you, Dr. Sonsolices, and good evening, everyone. And just to add to what Dr. Sonsolices is saying about the cleaning investments that we've made in bathrooms, we've also did other smaller investments around plumbing. We wanted to make sure that all sinks work, and also investments around the ventilation in bathrooms and exhaust fans, which are in bathrooms for COVID. But again, as Dr. Santalis is saying, the more larger capital investments of doing renovation in our bathrooms, we've done a complete assessment of all of our bathrooms across the district from a renovation perspective. And we are looking to slowly work in some of those investments into our capital program. But again, the investment, the need is significant in comparison to the resources that are available. So wholesale renovation of bathrooms is something that we would have to phase over a period of time because of the cost for those type of capital investments. But for smaller maintenance infrastructure type of investments, those are things that we are addressing as it relates to COVID and health and safety.
And I thank you for those answers, and I realize that it's a significant aspect of the capital budget. But when just reverting back to your presentation, when hand washing is a significant transmitter of COVID-19, of any type of viral infection within a school or within any crowded place, we need to make sure that we have at least those facilities in place whereby students, young adults, teachers, staff are able to properly utilize hand hygiene and hand washing to slow the spread of COVID-19 as we go back. And I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm going on a tangent. My apologies. But can we add to the action items a list of or that report or assessment of those bathroom facilities? I'd love to see ones in my district where they fall.
And I would also just add, Councilwoman, that we also did joint safety and cleanliness walks with the Baltimore Teachers Union, so that we actually had a cross section of participation to verify that buildings were in the state that they needed to be to ensure the safety. So in places that might have at one point needed additional attention, we did engage in those, what I would say cross team. It wasn't just our team, safety and cleanliness walks to make sure that those things were in place. So we would also want to crosswalk the time in which, folks might have been experiencing that.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Santelises. My next question actually is related to a particular line item. I was looking at the line item for the Chief Engagement Officer. The budget for that district office is, I believe, around about 3.8 million. And so I wanted to know, it was significantly smaller than the other budgets for the district office, given that we have such an engagement issue with schools, parent communities, educator communities, government resources. Can you share how that office will be able to leverage that 3.8 million against such a significant challenge that we're going to be faced with as students, parents, educators come back into the school in the fall.
So I do not know whether Chief High Cupboard has been advanced to the panel yet or not, and we can perhaps try to get her on. She did come later. But we can
Marguerite.
try to.
Tina Ike Hubbard.
Okay. But while we work on that, Councilwoman, what I would say is one, you're absolutely right. We have targeted some additional investment, again, when dollars remain flat. We have done some restructuring and reallocation of money so that there, for example, Chief High Cupboard advocated very strongly, to your point, for additional resources in translation. That has long been a sore spot in city schools. And so you will see this year, this budget cycle, far greater investment in translation services. You will also see that with regards to for example, the community school coordinators have been a major leveraging point for engagement. And again, not to cross Councilman Costello's edict, I will just say that our community school coordinators have been invaluable the last year and a half and have been very much leveraged to increase engagement. We've heard from a number of families, school leaders, teachers that without community school coordinators that we would have been really challenged with even more service to families and connection with families. So I think you'll see that there. And then finally, what I would say is that, again, within the one-time dollars, what you will see, particularly for this summer moving forward, that that we are making investment, even with those one-time dollars, in this process of engagement, because one of the things we all acknowledge is we're not just going to open schools and families are going to magically return. We are going to need to be on the ground. We have schools who are excellent at doing this, and we have others that need more support. And so that's an area that I think moving forward, thank you, ma'am, that's an area moving forward that I think you will also see with some of those ARA dollars, with some of those ESSER funds, even though it's not squarely in this budget. When we get to those one-time dollars, you will also see additional investments there. And I'm sure, like, if we can, whenever Chief High Cupboard can get here, she can add that. She is.
I'm here.
Tina, awesome. So
Yes,
I will
I'm
turn it
here.
over to you as well, ma'am.
Good evening, everyone. I just want to apologize. I'm in a car driving back from Hershey Park with my children. So you might hear a little bit of noise in the background. I want to clarify one point, though. The $3.8 million is actually general funds for our budget, and we actually have additional CPG, or Conservations of Poverty grant dollars. So our budget is actually closer to $13.8 million instead of 3.8, and it's because of the huge investment in the CPG dollars into our budget. That accounts for our community schools coordinators, a lot of our community engagement work, and as Dr. Simply has just shared, we are actually going to be investing additional dollars specifically in summer outreach to make sure that our families and our students know that we're here for them and prepared to receive them when we come back to school. We are also aligning, in terms of our 3R work, really intentional investments in engagement for the next 3 years. As many of you know, we just passed, it's fantastic, our new family community engagement policy at the district level. And so some of those additional dollars will be invested there. Last but not least, we have an amazing grant from the Hewlett Foundation to do some piloting work, both for youth engagement and for family engagement. So right now we have our FACE Fellowship. It's FACE, Family and Community Engagement Fellowship, where we have 24 schools doing really intensive training and support with our CARE MAP supports through our dual capacity framework. And so there's an investment there in that work. And if it works out really well, we hope to take it from a pilot to a larger strategy as part of the new recovery dollars that we're receiving. And then we also have a pilot around youth ambassadors, having our young people create a program at their school to engage young folks in change at their local school community, and giving schools a pathway that young people can actually have a larger voice in the governance and execution of the school community. So we're really excited about that. That's also a pilot. And as we like to know, we like to sort of test things out first, or Dr. S calls it beta testing, to make sure we know the strategy is going to work and that it has teeth. And then we can actually use some of those additional dollars as well to invest in deepening those two relations between the FACE Fellowship and our youth ambassadors. Last but not least, we are revamping our school family councils to be called school family community councils that actually have a real presence at schools. We know we've had a disparate implementation of those strategies at different schools, and we're going to work very hard to make sure those structures are stood up, they are strong, they have youth voice. We are now putting a young person on every single community council, grades 6 through 12. We are also going to put community members on there as well, so that we are really facing sort of what is youth, community, and family engagement at schools, and how they can create that two-way communication between the district and the schools, and transfer information back to us, as well as hearing information back through them. So there are significant investments that may not be clear through the original ask.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hyde-Hubbard and Dr. Santalese. I'm actually really encouraged to know that it's much higher than the 3 to 4 million that I saw on the PowerPoint presentation. I'm really encouraged by that. I'll turn it back over to the Vice Chair. I'll save my additional questions for the second round.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Glover. Councilwoman Ramos.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Santelises and team. Chief Perkins-Cohen, you and I went back and forth on email about this. Can we walk through the slide real quick? This is my question is about, and I took a picture of it, so I know I don't have to go back. And admittedly, this is the slide about how funding is calculated given the enrollment, particularly from this last year. So my concern was that if we were using September 2020's number for enrollment, that our schools would get fewer dollars for this coming year. That's going to be we're going to have full attendance, right? So that was the basis of my concern. And so this particular slide, and I don't know if it makes sense, Mr. Chair, to bring it back up so everybody can see it, talks about how the state funding, and like I said, I took a picture of it, so that's what I'm looking at. The state funding is based on the 2020 enrollment, okay? That's what the slide says. But there are some adjustments that are made, right? So just taking that state portion, so it's not like the state went back to 2019, which is what I thought they were going to do. The state went to 2020 numbers.
Yeah, so I'm going to let Chief Doherty, who's more of an expert on this than I, talk to the specifics about this, but and he pulled the information together to answer your question, Councilwoman. Chief Doherty.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I think I'm off mute. So, yes, the two slides that we put together, we were hoping that they were addressing the point that you raised, and it is a complex process. But yes, for FY22, the starting point in enrollment was the enrollment that was done, although it's done over a period of time. Think of it as the September 30th, 2020 enrollment count. And so in the slide that you have or took a photo of, so in that period, right, which was definitely just this last September, we started and we did the standard school by school count of children. And that count came in at, before the adjustments were made, it came in at 77,856. And then in this rather complex process, you then take that number and you take out certain groups of kids. You take out pre-K, which is funded separately. You take out the seed school, which is funded separately, and you do some adjustments. And then, only because I want to try to be responsive, you also then look and see, because it isn't just the children who are in the seats on September 30th. It's actually, you have to satisfy some other criteria as well. You can't have missed 10 days in a row, for example. And so there is that adjustment period, right, as I'm sure you know. So then that lower number is arrived at, which is the 73,067 that you see. With that number, We then, though, that's the basis. We then go through a school by school, grade by grade process, and to make projections for FY22. So it's an important and time-consuming process, but it's super necessary. And not only does it go school by school, it goes grade by grade. And so a particular school will talk about how many, for example, how many kids historically drop off between first grade and second grade. In this particular context, it was also the case that the school was very much saying, for the lack of a better term, school-based specific circumstances that they wanted the finance office to know. And then from that 73,000 number, we get to a 75,006 number, right?
Right.
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 And
So I saw that in the next piece, you actually are not using the 73 number, you're using the 75,000 number.
That's correct.
And it seems to make sense because when you talked about the other piece, the local funding, you actually used the last 3 years average.
Yes.
Right. And so that's what I was looking for, is whether or not we're using a slightly different formula for this year. And it looks like that's the case.
That is the case. So that what you just said is absolutely the case. And it would be in those school by school, grade by grade discussions, for example, that a school would.
I'm sorry, I want to interject here. It sounds like we're like in a pretty long explanation. It's like pretty in the weeds here. I want to try to keep things moving. I want to make sure that we have a budgetary question here. We've got 4 other people who haven't had any questions yet. I'm just trying to keep time here a little bit.
No, I got my answer to the first part of my question. So I appreciate that there was the slide and then we could read that. The second part is, I think, where you were going, Chris, which was, that you are indeed going to be working school by school to make sure that they have what they need for this upcoming school year. Whatever the number was this past year, you're going to get them as much as they're supposed to have given the school enrollment that they project, correct?
Short answer is yes, ma'am. Yes, Councilwoman. And a quick addition is, although that process is done every year, it is it is going to be done even more, if that makes sense, this year, because it's the most remarkable year from the point of view of changes. So, but what you said is yes. And one of the things we're proud of is just that we interact with each school and have lots of backs and forth specifically about their context. And yes, we're going to do everything we can so that they have what they need in this one-of-a-kind, return to normal kind of year.
Yeah, because again, my concern was where that point was going to be, and knowing that kids are going, I'm sending my kid back, there's no question about that. And so I think all of us feel the same way, those of us parents. So we not everybody, but I understand we're doing another option for parents who don't. But I'm just saying, we want to make sure that they have the funding that they need for all the public health issues and concerns that my colleague just brought up, but also for the other pieces. Okay,
yes.
I'm done. Thank you.
And we're also going to have that one-time money that we talked about.
Yes, right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Bullock. I don't see Councilman Bullock on here. Councilman Torrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Santelises and team, for being here this evening. My question is related to re-engaging young people who are between ages of 18 and 21, but also our young people who found jobs in this pandemic. The question is, how are we going to gear towards the engagement and bringing them back, knowing that we can be flexible virtually? And then the second part of my question is, how are we investing to make sure we can make that happen?
No, thank you. Thank you, Councilman Torrance. No, and this is a very big and looming question for us. I would, ask Chief Davis to also speak to part of this. But I will begin by saying, Councilman, that one of the areas that we're seeing in our feedback from stakeholder groups that really is confirmed from what we saw through the past year is that we need to be more deliberate, and we are planning to invest more in how we scale more flexible scheduling options, particularly at the high school level. So the large investment that we as a city and frankly a community made in technology has actually afforded us an opportunity we haven't had before. And that is to provide kind of flexible scheduling options for young people, the ability to take and engage in classes very differently. So for all of the challenges of distance and virtual learning, we also know that it's a tool that we can use to provide more options for young people. The other piece that we are doing within this, and we have heard the same thing, by the way. So within our student focus groups, just conversations I've had with young people in particular, within particular community groups and others, we know that the allure of work is real. And so a lot of what we will be doing, and we actually have a partnership with Baltimore's Promise, specifically targeting older students, both who are at the end of their high school career as well as those who are recent graduates, to really re-engage them not only through the world of work, but in other ways of being able to complete their schooling and increase that. So that is a big focus area for us. It's something that the community will see. It's being verified in some of the feedback we've received on at least the initial input. We will also see when we release some of the draft work plans and get feedback on, but technology is a major leverage for that, as well as just, how do we make work opportunities more accessible for some of our young people, and really accelerate the work in that area that we were doing previously. But how are we using federal funds to accelerate that is another place. Chief Davis, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes. Again, additionally to what Dr. Santelises just said, we also started a virtual evening school with a small group of students. And at first, the attendance was a little hit or miss, but as we made some changes, some students got back on track, and I know some are on track to graduate with their last few credits that they're earning. And so the year hasn't ended yet. We have some outcome data to look at the end of the year to see, right, the profile of student that best meets the kind of opportunity of a virtual evening school. But I think, Councilmember Torrance, directly to your question, we have to be as flexible as possible with things like a virtual evening school. And again, some students got into this and I know are going to benefit from it. So we'll have to figure out to how much of a scale we can go moving forward when we kind of look at the outcomes at the end of the year.
Thank you. I don't know about my colleagues, but I would love to see the data because I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm going to violate our rule about district specifics. I have Sandtown Winchester, and I have a, sorry, as you can hear, family life pandemic, but I have a large number of adult population in my district that are either persons who need to be re-engaged or are struggling with families that need multiple streams of income. So one of the things I want to do is make sure that when you guys roll that out is that we can somehow support that and do an engagement through my council district to make sure that we're catching those people, because what I'm learning is that these families need those supports. And I'm encouraged that we're looking at providing that flexibility, because it's one of my biggest issues, because unbeknownst to most districts, I have a large number of squeegee young men and women that I'm working with the mayor's office on capturing and getting them re-engaged in other portions of city work as well as their families. So this is just adding on to that amount that we can actually as a resource. But thank you. And I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Torrance. Melissa, can we do a follow-up with Councilmember Torrance on that specifically? Thank you. Councilmember Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Dr. Santelises, for all the work that you and your team do for our young people in the city. I have two pretty straightforward questions. One may not be the most intelligent question, but I'll ask it anyway. The first question I have is with regard to the the base per pupil change from 20 to 21. Now, for traditional schools, it stayed the same, but for charter schools, it went down slightly. I was wondering if you could tell me why and where that funding went if it did go down.
Sure, and I'm going to invite Chief Doherty to walk you through that. But I did need to say, Councilman Conway, that was not even close to being a bad question. So we are more than fine.
Oh, you haven't heard my second one yet.
Okay, that's all right. I'm sure it'll be okay. But Chief Doherty, can you please walk us all, and Councilman Conway in particular, through that change in the baseline funding for charter schools as opposed to traditional schools, sir?
Yes, I with pleasure. I would almost, and not just for time purposes. The charter formula is entirely different from the other formula. It's based on revenues, and it's based on looking at historic revenues. And the fact is, it's an elaborate calculation that I think a side-by-side from year to year is probably the best way to show it for the councilman's question. And I can send that, even tonight, as just here's the formula that led to the FY21 and here's the formula that led to the FY22. But the short, non-weedy answer is that it's entirely different from the way the overall general fund dollars are delivered, and it's a multi-part formula. So is there a way that I can put it together even during the discussion here, and then either put it in the chat or send it to the councilman directly? I mean,
Councilman Cohen, would that suffice for you to get it in writing? I know from having asked about this in the past that it's quite complex, and
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you. It's certainly not a dodge. I think this will be the most clarity and the least distracting for the rest of the meeting, but I can do that tonight.
And council member, can I just ask that you would distribute that around to the rest of our colleagues when you get it? Thank you, sir.
Can I just interject one quick thing on that, which is I think that makes total sense. I think that's the right way to handle it. And I think I just want to offer that if anybody wants a charter school funding 101 session, which we've done for many members before, I think it is helpful. And we can just sit down and go through it too. So if anybody wants that, please let us know.
Sure. Thank you. All right, now for the silly question. You guys ready? All right, so I realize we have a lot of conversation around pupils per pupil, the number of pupils that are interacting with the system. And, it got me to thinking a little bit about some of the great, we're very fortunate to have a bunch of 21st century schools. What do we do by way of recruiting? We may already be doing this, but are we touting some of our schools, some of our strong schools, and some of the opportunities for families to rejoin the public school system?
No, that is not. That is yet again not a crazy question. It's a very on point question for the reasons that you said. So, and I think that Chief Highcupboard, the communications team, has been working really hard to make sure that we're getting out the good news stories, particularly as as relates to the deluge of sometimes counter narratives that certain venues love to perpetrate. But I will also say that Chief Perkins Cohen and the 21st Century Office definitely do that kind of outreach. And what we are seeing, and I'll let Tina talk a little bit more, Chief Highcupboard talk a little bit more about some of that. But what we are definitely seeing, Councilman Conway, is that new buildings, while not sufficient, right? Like you've got to still have quality leadership, you've got to still have quality programming, but from an immediate standpoint, our families vote with their feet. And in the case where we do have those other elements in place, it is absolutely something that you see drives up enrollment and enrollment even between schools. So it does make a difference. One of my favorite examples is Reach. And when that principal and his team describe the difference in the young adolescents, the high school students that go to Reach, and just how attendance levels have gone up, interest has gone up, care of the building by the young people themselves. We see that the investment, that's been lobbied by, you, your colleagues, our city delegation, for new buildings matter. Now, new buildings have to have solid education going on, but word spreads very quickly, and that we're seeing those patterns. But Tina, did you want to add a little bit more about some of the work we're doing to actually promote, again, some of the strong news, good news stories that we're seeing, with regards to as Councilman noted, basically getting families back?
Absolutely. And I'd also like to talk about our enrollment efforts really briefly as well. So we are actually working right now with an outside consultant to interview every single office at city schools and think through a plan of how we actually get our good news stories out and really get them documented, sort of think through what are the things that folks want to know about our schools and have more affiliation to the positive stories and the positive things that are happening. There's so many things that are happening, and we need to tell our own story instead of our story being told as a narrative by somebody else. So we're really working hard with that. We're hoping to produce a larger campaign that will come out over the summer months, partly to begin our summer engagement work, but then to go on throughout the years around sharing those stories. We've already started doing a community champion at our board meetings. We're starting to do a student of the month at our board meetings, just to sort of share and highlight those fantastic things. What I will also quickly share with you is that for our enrollment work, because we were in the pandemic, we actually did video recordings of all of our choice options. So families could go to our website, they could view a video of what was happening at each of our schools and really get a better feel for what those options look like for them. So instead of just hearing, oh, I think Merville's a great school, or I think this, they actually could interact with those videos and then have choice liaisons walk them through the process so they knew what their real options were and they made really informed choices. There's also, you'll see in the budget, an investment in reimagining an ECT, or our Enrollment Choice and Transfer Office, so we can improve our choice systems, we can improve our transfer processes and better serve our families. The ultimate goal is to connect families to the academic success of their children. And through ECT and reimagining the process and making it easier for families to figure out where they want to be enrolled and encourage them, we'll also hopefully bring our kids, back to school in a robust way.
Thank you so much. And I'll say, I say that partially because of my own personal experience, having a chance to walk through one of the 21st century schools in my district with you, Dr. Santelises, and I was amazed. It was the nicest school I've ever been in. So, I think we've got a lot of really strong stories, strong opportunities, and I think possibilities of upping those per pupils and that number, and hopefully bringing some additional funding to the schools that sorely need it. So, thank you guys. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. Before I go to Councilman Cohen, I will just make a point of saying the city schools has very clearly been the victim of a couple of years, especially of a concerted smear campaign by local media at Fox Baltimore and Sinclair Broadcasting, and I'm not reluctant at all to name them outright. I think it's despicable, and I think that City Schools has done an exceptional job of showing its backbone and standing up tall to highlight its successes in response to all that they've done to continuously attack our school system. So I want to thank everybody that has had any part, large or small, in that effort. Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to pile on to that uplifting note for a quick moment, which is to say, I do want to thank the city schools team, particularly community school coordinators, educators, Dr. Santelises, your team, for the work during the pandemic. I just think folks were heroes out there, like the amount of delivery of food services, getting the laptops to kids. It was real crunch time and crisis, but I really think people stepped up in a big way. And that is really to be commended. And we were glad as the council to provide some support early on for the tech. But I just think, I saw so many educators, community school coordinators, and others just go above and beyond for our children and our families in this pandemic. And I think it really should be recognized by our city. With that said, I am looking at the costs of transportation, which remains a challenge. And I feel like we've been having this conversation for, I don't say 5 years, really, since Councilman Burnett and I picked a fight with the MTA way back when over bus passes. And for colleagues, part of it is driven by the cost of transporting individual children with special needs, as well as children experiencing homelessness to and from school. But I know that we had a work group related to transportation costs and needs. It just continues to feel like we're not getting our money's worth when we think about the poor service that MTA provides for so many of our families, and that can take kids up to an hour and a half to get to school. Can you, Dr. Sanalices, provide an update on that work and sort of where are we headed in terms of reducing costs and increasing efficiency for kids getting to school?
No, thank you, Councilman Cohen, and I do want to add my thanks for you and the City Council for your continued advocacy for city school students and their access to transportation. You are absolutely right. This is a long, ongoing issue, and some of it really is our dependence on MTA and where MTA sits within the priorities of the state. And that service, our ability to oversee that service, and again, we partner. I'm going to, Dr. Washington can give us a more kind of precise update, but I will say this. That as you might have noted in the presentation, we began probably 2 years ago to really talk seriously about how do we actually increase city schools fleet, which is in some ways ironic given, we're actually building, trying to build back a fleet. But part of why we had that strategy is because we hear continually from families that they prefer having city schools employed drivers on their child's route. I mean, just as a very at a very basic level, even for some of our younger students. Families are clear, and frankly, the feedback has been clear that city schools employees just do a better job at attending to students' needs, at recognizing the educational value of being on time, right, for both families as well as for children. And so it has been a deliberate part of our strategy. We've had fits and starts with that given the pandemic, where we have investigated and looked at ways at using some of perhaps this one-time money to bolster some of those efforts. But I will just tell you, it's hard when you don't have direct supervision and when you have the state having such a heavy hand. And frankly, if it weren't for the advocacy of city council, of local elected officials, we might be in an even worse place than we are. But I will ask Dr. Washington if she can give you some more specifics to what I think is your ongoing question, and rightly so, and that is, where are we improving? Where can we hope to go in more specific? But that has been one of our strategies, has been how do we just increase a fleet that we have more control over, because we have greater control over the quality of service. But it's just hard in a city where there's so much, particularly at the high school level, so much choice. But Dr. Washington, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, and so I think Dr. Sansolis, you're very comprehensive in that response. I think the only thing that I would say to add is that in our conversations with MTA, again, we were able to, because of the advocacy of a number of different folks, we were able to stop the additional cuts that were going to be proposed to be made around the time when the pandemic and even continuing after. I would say that our ongoing conversations right now with MTA about services is more isolated incidents where we're following up with them on different parts of the city or areas where it's been flagged for us that there have been significant delays, but there hasn't been any other further conversations as it relates to that for or any further movement as it relates to that for MTA. Dr. Santalisa has talked a little bit about our 5-year plan where we're slowly building up our own internal fleet. So again, as Dr. Santalisa said, to have a little bit more control. I think that one of the things that I would flag is that there is new legislation that happened during this past legislation session that is allowing us to look at other transportation options outside of buses in order to transport our students. And that was something that Baltimore City had been pushing on, but the ability to use vans and some different other options in order to transport our students. And so that's another thing that we can look at in terms of looking at efficiency and addressing, but it does not address the students that are using MTA services. It would be more so our students that are using yellow bus services and contractual services.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those things where we get for service and we pay a lot for it. And so, it does feel like if we can leverage some of this federal money for our own fleet, it might be something to do. Thanks for that. My second question is around tech and the internet. Dr. Sanalises, again, throughout the pandemic, really enjoyed partnering with you at points and with Chief Hike Hubbard and some of the students from Somos who just played a huge leadership role, and teachers and everyone else on really trying to figure out in this crisis how to help our young people close the digital divide and get to have an education, which was totally reliant on the internet. While virtual school may be over pretty soon, the need for young people to be digitally literate as well as to have internet access is not going to be over. So wondering what City Schools is doing sort of in the immediate and then longer term, given what we saw during the pandemic and just the challenges with Comcast and just the issues that so many young people and families had. What are we doing to really take advantage of, again, the federal money and this moment of recovery that we're in around tech and digital literacy and closing the digital divide?
So I will say that, as you noted, Councilman, Chief Hike Hubbard did a lot of lift on this. We are going to be welcoming a new chief of IT to the team shortly. But I will say that we definitely recognize that the need for continuing the investment in technology in internet. Tina can speak directly to the Comcast piece, I think, that you asked for. But one of the things that you saw in the budget, or that we noted in our overview presentation, is we are making, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, unprecedented and accelerated investment in the tech infrastructure in city schools. So there were things that we continually put off because we didn't have the budget for it that we are now investing in. So over $12 million in switches at the building level, which will increase the bandwidth and the internet access, high-speed internet for every school in the city. We did some work, the IT team with Michael Rating and others. You might have noticed there was a distinct shift when there was a fuller return back into schools, and we heard from a number of teachers and principals just the difficulty of accessing the internet when schools first returned. Our team worked over spring break. There was a significant decline in that, but we knew it was a stopgap. So we've got over $13 million going into switches. We have a huge dark fiber investment. That's a multi-million-dollar investment of these one-time funds. The other piece is we're really leveraging the early work, frankly, even around devices. We never had, as a school district, a one-to-one device target for young people. And I think what the last year and a half has brought to light, as you noted, is even without a pandemic or even in a waning phases of a pandemic, the need for that access to technology and high-speed internet is not going anywhere. So what we're doing now is kind of going the last mile, because we know these are one-time dollars, to really look at devices. So which devices really should we be targeting for high school students, as opposed to kind of the let's just buy and get things out? How do we replenish what's in schools? So we actually will be purchasing more devices to make sure we as city schools, you as city council, will be able to say, we are a one-to-one, one device to one student school district.
You say device, Chromebooks?
It's a combination. So one of the things that we are looking at now that we have a year and a half under our belt around this is what actually are the devices that are needed for example, a K-2 student, where tablets worked incredibly well for our pre-K students, not a Chromebook. And some of our CTE students at high school, for who the Chromebook actually was a strain at the high school level, because they couldn't do everything they needed to. But for a fifth grader, a Chromebook worked just fine. So what I think you'll see is more differentiation in devices based on need, whereas earlier, when things first broke, it was just, let's get Chromebooks, let's get them out. And now I think what you'll see is that we're reflecting on that a little bit more, so that we can have specialized technology depending on where students are, both developmentally and in their studies. Tina, did you want to add on the Comcast specifically for Councilman Cohen?
If there's something specific and brief that we need to hear about Comcast, otherwise I'd like to keep it moving.
Yeah.
I think that was an excellent to hear about
Yes.
the level of investment.
Yeah.
Contract for up.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Quickly, I would just say we actually we had up to 7,000 families we were going to sponsor on Comcast. Only 1,000 families are currently being sponsored. The majority of our families actually have the ease and access of the T-Mobile hotspot. Has been a much easier way for us to get internet to them. We were awarded 11,000 additional hotspots. So the Emergency Connectivity Fund will help us pay for the continuation of those hotspots through the next school year, so our families will still have internet access available to them at home.
Great. Thank you, Chief High Hubbard. Thank you, Dr. Santelices. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just a really brief shout out to Kimberly Vasquez, who was recognized by the Vice President of the United States for her work on helping to close the digital divide. Thanks again.
Thank you. So I just want to do a quick check here. It is 8:52. We began this hearing at 6:45. So we are just over 2 hours, and there was about a half an hour of presentation. So it's taken us an hour and a half to get through this first round of questioning. And I want to make sure that everybody gets another round of questioning in here in the next hour. So I'm going to ask everybody to make their questions and their responses even more concise and to the point. And so I'm going to go back to Council President Mosby. Council Vice President Middleton.
Some of my questions were pretty much answered with some of the other council members. So I yield my time. Thank you again, Dr. Santelices and your team. And just remember that we are here to help you in any way we can.
Okay, I have a couple of questions here. I just looked back through the slide deck, and I didn't see a slide that was specifically, here's how much American Rescue Plan money we're getting, and here's how we're determining to use that money, or here's our plan on planning to how we're going to determine to use that money. Can you please address how much are you getting and how are you going to figure out how to spend it?
Sure. No, thank you, Councilman Dorsey. I'm going to also ask the Chief of Staff. So I will begin and just let you know that the slides on the ESSER dollars will walk you through the money that we've received so far for from the federal government. So the American CARES Act, the earlier dollars. So you'll see like there's ESSER 1, there's ESSER 2, the large pot of money that like 450 million or something. That's what we are planning now. And that's the reconnect, recover, and reimagine initiative that we've been talking about in terms of the planning. So that planning is not complete. We've been getting community feedback. We've been getting input on that. And so we can certainly update City Council once that planning is complete so that you'll be able to see what some of that is. But Allison, did you want to quickly, I'm trying to be concise. Maybe I should have just let you answer.
No,
Do you
no,
have anything
that's
to add?
right. That's right. That last pot of money, it's 443 million, 449. That's the pot. That's the American Recovery Plan piece. That's the part we're in the process of developing the plan for now, and have engaged the community in extensive engagement over the last month, and will continue till we have a final plan later this month for those pieces.
Hey, Allison, real quick, the ARP funding, is that coming in tranches similar to how the city's allocation is, or is that, have you received that entire allocation?
That is our, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but the amount that I'm identifying there is the 443 million, I believe, is our total allotment from that plan.
That's correct. The 443.5 is our total allotment, and Councilman Costello, we have not received any of that yet, unlike ESSER 1 and 2 or CARES and CRRSA. So the ESSER 3, the biggest of them, ultimately we think it'll probably come in 2 tranches based on first the state getting their portion and sending it, and then so it'll mainly be 2 tranches, none of which we've received yet.
And that's a pass-through through the State Department of Education from ARP?
The state gets to keep some of it for various activities, but the 443 and change is our allotment. So that amount is what's going to city schools.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I asked the question the wrong way. Is the 443, is that allocation, does that come directly from Department of Treasury, or is that passed through the Maryland State Department of Education?
It goes through MSDE.
Got it. And but there's no guidance on when that money's coming in, or in what size the tranches will be. I'm just curious.
Not as of yet, no.
Okay. Can you please keep the committee updated once you get guidance from either Treasury or MSDE?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, great. So in light of that, and we've had a little bit of discussion about potential uses and hopes for use of one-time funds. And so I guess I'm just going to make my plug here for that. We have seen a significant increase in bicycling throughout the city and across the country, around the world throughout this pandemic. I would say we've even seen a much more visible presence of Black cyclists in the city. And over the years, in particular, when Black cyclists and people of color are surveyed about what would get them cycling more, rising to the top of the list is a safe place to store my bike when I get where I'm going. And I think that, to piggyback on Councilman Cohen's question about transportation, and to, lift up the good work that the Department of Transportation is doing to make Baltimore a more cycling and complete streets oriented city. I think it would be a missed opportunity to not have schools investing in trying to get more students and faculty cycling to schools. And I'd be remiss not to mention that there's also a wealth of research that talks about how people are more attentive, happier, feel healthier, more productive when they cycle and use active transportation to get to schools. And it's just something that I think that can bridge a lot of the transportation gap for a lot of people. I'd like to see the schools doing more to encourage that in every way that it can.
No, thank you, Councilman Dorsey. And I think one of the things that would be helpful and an opportunity for more follow-up is any specific recommendations you might have for places for schools to start with with being more supportive in that area. So just knowing that this is, an area that you've done a lot of work in, that might be a great place to get some feedback from you on that as well.
Top of that list is safe indoor storage of for bikes.
I thought you might say that.
Outdoor is really vulnerable. Indoor is really the way to go. But there are a lot of other things that I really thank you for being interested and willing to have a further conversation about this. I will definitely be following up about that.
Okay.
Councilman Stokes. Councilmember Burnett.
Okay.
Yep.
Am I coming through?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I can hear you.
You said my right. Hold on.
We see you. Or we
Cool.
did.
Am I,
Yeah,
am I
you're back.
Okay.
Yeah,
You
you're
are.
here.
Perfect. All right. So another question I had, and this is probably more around the lines of how you're preparing for it. So the General Assembly passed legislation this term requiring the installation of child appropriate or youth appropriate menstrual hygiene products in city schools. Can you talk about, I know that the implementation period is a little bit lengthy, but can you, I guess, speak to where it sits in the budget now, I guess preparations for that to make sure that our young students have everything they need?
No, and it's a great non-time question, Councilman Burnett. Part of what I do know is that we're still in the midst of assessing what that need is going to look like. I will ask Dr. Washington if she has anything she'd like to add about this, but I do know that we're in the midst of doing an assessment on this area. Dr. Washington?
Yes, so we're still assessing it. One of the first steps that we took was we changed our educational specifications for new constructed buildings. And so we're in the process of amending that, but we're still assessing what the impact is going to be for all of our existing buildings across the board. So still in the process of assessing the impact.
Okay. And I guess, is your anticipation that there are there any issues that you've seen so far that would prohibit like sort of an on-time implementation period or any setbacks with that?
No, nothing that, I mean, it's just been passed. And so we are looking at what are the costs, who are the vendors for installation and some of those different things like that. So I would say we're still in the very beginning parts of assessing it.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. I mean, and this is something, again, when I looked at the implementation period, I knew you may or may not have an answer, but I guess as you progress along, I'd like to keep checking in on that and see how that's going. The second question I had was around partnerships and out of school time. Dr. Sanalisas, I guess what has that looked like so far in trying to bring partners into schools? And I guess what does it look like as you progress forward? As we talk about sort of the other arts-based programming and tech and STEM and everything else that we look to for partner organizations that provide young people.
Yeah, no, and this is something I definitely will let Chief High Hubbard speak more about, but I will just give the overview that one of the silver linings to come out of this last year and a half has been the amount of community support of young people in city schools. So everything from members of the faith community stepping forward to expand our summer offerings, our work with community mental health organizations who have helped to augment and frankly find young people. Some of our youth organizations who have helped really mobilize young people and their leadership during this time. So we really are, I think, at a stage where, Chief High Hubbard has prioritized making sure that partners have a way of connecting, even to the point where I know she and Chief Dabrowski have are partnering now for our tutoring. One of the things that I'm most proud of is the fact that when you look at who is tutoring our young people, it's an overwhelming majority are people from our community, from Baltimore City high school students. So when we talk about partnership, it really does run like the full gamut. Tina, did you want to add anything? It's hard being in the car.
Okay, can everybody hear me? I'm here.
Yeah.
Just taking a while to unmute. So thank you for this. I will say we're doing an extensive amount of partnership work. I'm very proud of this work. Actually, Monique Sims, our manager of partnerships and volunteers, has been absolutely fantastic. We actually are having now quarterly partner convening, so partners actually get direct communication from us and connection to how they can actually partner. We created a pie portal so we can actually track and measure partnership effectiveness, but also give them a direct way to work with schools. And we're now developing a partnership strategic plan in partnership with Baltimore's Promise, funded by the T. Rowe Price Foundation to really solidify our partnership strategy. We are also then working with our out of school time partners to figure out sort of when they can get back in buildings, what that looks like, and better align them to the supports with around our tutoring support and other things in schools to make sure our out of school time partners are able to then provide and extend robust services to students. So more to come on that. It's a work in progress, but I'm very excited about a recent development in our faith-based community of working with them around summer programming and hopefully cementing further our connection of having young folks in their care and presence being able for tutoring and summer opportunities. So more to come on that, but we are definitely putting a significant investment in the way we partner with other organizations across the city.
Got it. Thank you. Those are my two questions, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the thorough responses.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna I know we're getting late in the night here, but I do want to remind everybody of the chair's request earlier that folks keep their cameras on. So I'm gonna assume that council members who are on here without their camera on are not actually present, and I'm not gonna call on you. I'm going to go next to, I know Councilwoman Porter was here in the chambers with us earlier, but she had to run. I'm going to go to Councilmember Ramos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have another budget question with what's in the budget book. It talks here about health benefits are cut significantly between last year and this year. I'm assuming that's for retirees, excuse me, that's for retirees. So you've got, a new plan, I guess, for the retirees. Is that what's happening?
Chief Grant Skinner, would you like to weigh in on the benefits figures? And then Chief Doherty, you can also support on this.
Our retiree health benefits actually come through the city. So the estimate on the retiree health benefits is from what the city provides. So I think that's what you're referring to as a change.
Okay, because all the health benefits got switched over. So, okay, that's what I wasn't sure where that was coming from.
Thanks,
so,
Allison.
Okay.
I think it was a switch to Medicaid Advantage. Yep. Sorry.
Yeah, it's part of what the rest of the city did. Okay, I got it. Thanks, Mr. Chair. My colleagues are doing a wonderful job asking all of my questions, so I'm good. Thanks.
Awesome. Councilmember Torrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is really towards our outreach for pre-K and kindergarten. It's one of the things I do worry about with a number of my schools in my district. So I just want to know, what efforts are we going to plan for this summer?
No, absolutely, Councilman Torrance, and I have been having targeted conversations with both Dr. Dabrowski and Chief High Cupboard about this. A real shout out to our Family and Community Engagement and Enrollment Office. This is the first year where we really have had, even in the midst of a pandemic, have had early outreach. The office sponsored virtual information sessions targeted to pre-K families, K families this summer. We really are honing in on a lot of play-based opportunities for our youngest learners. You know, as the dad of a young learner, that at that time, you know, play is really important, and that's what a lot of our young people have missed. The ability to socialize. I was with a pre-K teacher today over at Baybrook. And a lot of what those young people were engaging in are some of the same activities that we want to have available over the summer, much more around socialization, much more opportunity to understand kind of developmental choice. So kids were, they were doing examination of peppers, they were doing yoga. I got to participate in some yoga today. And so really our goal is to, one, have very catered opportunities. Chief High Cupboard will remember just how many families, which is the largest we've ever had, who tuned in for information specifically for pre-K and K. We now have a far more streamlined, because of the work of the enrollment office, our early learning office, more streamlined registration for those families. So fortunately, a lot of the investment we had made in pre-K and K enrollment prior to the pandemic is paying off, but it really is also offering those opportunities for our youngest learners that so many of our students just weren't able to get at home.
Thank you. And then my next question is really pandemic specific. As we see the rising number of evictions being filed in our court system, how are we going to support our families who will now be either doubled up or homeless going into the fall?
Yeah, no, and it is a spot on question, Councilman Torrance. And what I would say is we have seen the year over year increases in the number of homeless students, which you might remember from your time in city schools, that we've seen that year over year increase. And this year, with regards to just the skyrocketing numbers, we actually piloted, you know, with partners, you know, with North Bay, actual residential opportunities for students that were residential virtual learning. And what it's really going to come down to is better coordination and targeted investment in the supports for those families and things that we know are always needed. That is transportation, so that young people have stability within school, even if it's not at home. And this is a place, frankly, where our community school coordinators have really shown brilliantly, because they have access to the information about housing supports. And so, frankly, over the last year and a half, we have a number of families who we've been able to connect to the resources that the city already has to support young people. And so our community schools coordinators have really been on the front line of connecting families to resources. But the reality is we're going to have to continue to work with the city around this. We're going to have to continue, you know, to really ramp up some of the specialized, you know, mental health supports and things that we were gradually contributing to in years that now we're just going to have to ramp up.
Thank you, Dr. Santelises.
Thank you.
Councilman Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No further questions. I think everyone's touched on the ones that I had.
Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 9:15, we're doing all right on a Friday. Thanks for sticking with us, Dr. Santelises and team. Pre-K, when do we think as a system we're going to be able to move toward universal pre-kindergarten? What's kind of the map or the move to get us there? We know that Kerwin passed, thank God, this year. We know that we have more local contribution to do. But can we talk about how we're moving toward what I hope to see eventually being universal pre-K3? What does that trajectory look like?
Sure. So I won't spend lots of time just talking about how actually Baltimore City was one of the state forerunners in an increased and significant access to pre-K. But I will ask Chief Perkins Cohen, can you give shed a little insight into where we are with Kerwin and then the corresponding ability to offer even more pre-K seats to get to the universal pre-K that Councilman Cohen just referenced.
Yeah, so we to Dr. Santelises' point, since we were an early, one of the first implementers of full day pre-K as part of the earlier some of the early precursor to Kerwin legislation, there has been increasing funding for pre-K that we've received from the state. So currently we do receive 100% of the base per pupil for pre-K for any students who attend our pre-K. That is much better than it used to be. It is still not paying the full cost of pre-K, just so you understand. The base per pupil is just the base amount. Most of our students also qualify for the poverty weight or special ed or English language learner weight, and you don't get that on the pre-K students. So we're still subsidizing pre-K currently. As we shift over to
hey, Allison, apologies, real quick. How much total is a pre-K seat? How much does they cost, like all in?
I was going to just do quick math here on my computer and my calculator. It is let's see. I'll do that in a second, okay? But so I don't know it off the top of my head. I have to do it quickly. I mean, you're basically talking a teacher and a para, and then you're talking instructional materials, and so I'd have to give you an estimate on that. I mean, a teacher is with salary and benefits around $100,000. A para is, I think, probably more like $80,000. There's about 20 students per a pre-K seat, and then I don't know exactly what to assume for a materials cost. And then of course there's heating the space. So that actually gets me to a bigger issue, which is we are there are some space limitations at some point when you start getting to pre-K. What we do currently is we do have a long enrollment period for students who are in our priority status, who are high poverty, or who are special needs first, before we make seats for other students to make sure that we're having space for our higher priority students first. We have not maxed out our pre-K, and this year, like many districts, we saw a real dip in pre-K. And I think one thing that's a real question mark is what will happen to those students next year, and will those students go on to K, or will some families choose to start their child who didn't enter in pre-K this year in pre-K? So that's a question we don't know yet. About half, we went down by nearly half in our pre-K. Which is pretty consistent with what we've seen across the district. Our other grades actually were the same or went up, and so that's why our enrollment was fairly flat. But in pre-K, we saw a real drop in families just choosing that they didn't want to start in a virtual space. And so that's an understandable decision that many families made. That we'll have to see how that pans out in this next year. I don't remember how many years it takes to get the full for the pre-K funding to phase in. I'd have to get back to you with that information. As you saw from the slide that Chief Doherty showed, it's 10 years for the funding for Kerwin to phase in general. So it's a pretty slow ramp up, and the different pieces phase in at different times. So I'd have to get back to you with how quickly it takes to phase in all the funding for pre-K. But one of the expenses will be is outfitting space to make sure we have enough space for all the students.
Great. Yeah, if you could just maybe send to the committee as a request that timeline, that would be much appreciated. And then finally, want to again commend city schools for some of the work on restorative practices, be it the Positive School Center, be it many of our community schools, many of our schools generally, just the push around restorative practices, I think, is huge. We also, as a city in 2020, became the first in the country to legislate trauma-informed care. We are now implementing the Healing City Act and had some conversations with the Whole Student Center, or sorry, Whole Student Office about city schools coming in through an MOU. We have not yet signed that or finished that MOU, but just want to make sure you all are still committed, as I think that we'll see just a number of young people who've endured a very high level of trauma coming out of the pandemic. So want to make sure we're staying on track for that.
Yes, no, I mean, to my knowledge, nothing has changed in terms of the runway for that. And if anything, I think what we're doing is putting kind of additional resources into work to make sure that young people are solid with regards to their mental health and their overall well-being. And one of the things that we have heard is that wellness is addressed in many forms. But yes, no, to my knowledge, Councilman, I don't think there's any deviation from that commitment.
Great. That's great to hear. Again, thank you to your whole team for all the work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. We made it through round 2 in 30 minutes. This is great. And I know that there are a couple people who members who are still on screen here who have already said that they don't have any other questions. I'm going to come back to the ones who are on screen and who may still have other questions. I do have one more of my own. There are at least 2 schools in my district where they have or have had churches operating in them. And I guess when I've asked about this, the kind of boilerplate response is we want to make our schools places where communities can meet, where community organizations can meet. These churches that are operating in these schools are things that, to my knowledge and to other community members who live in the neighborhoods immediately around the schools, largely, to my knowledge, have no association with these churches or whatever. They're not community rooted churches necessarily. They're just churches operating out of a school. Is there, not just for churches, but in general, for any community-based organization, non-school-based organization operating in these schools, any set of objective kind of standards for like what makes them a community-based organization, and what makes them, what makes this part of fulfilling a mission to create, a lot of these folks are just they're not from the neighborhoods at all. It's a place where they meet. Just like many of the churches in Baltimore are made up of congregations of people who don't live in Baltimore at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I would say is, and Dr. Washington might be able to add with regards to permits, we try to equalize what the permit requirements are across organizations. So we don't necessarily make a differential We don't make a difference between, I mean, certainly we don't want an organization located in Anne Arundel County necessarily using it, but when we talk about neighborhood-based, particularly in schools, where we have citywide enrollment, that's not necessarily something that like we're tracking or is part of the criteria. But Dr. Washington, do you want to add kind of, at least on the permit question, what the criteria are currently for any organization, be it churches or anything else that are using our space? Do you want to weigh in on that?
So when we look at a space in terms of the criteria, or a partner in terms of criteria, is a lot of it is if it's a community use, but we don't have any restrictions outside of a partner that may be operating outside of board requirements. So we have board policy that talks about use of our spaces, and if a partner is operating outside of that policy, such as serving alcohol on site or something else that may be in non-compliance with the policy, then we would restrict them. But if they're in compliance, they go through a permit process where we look at, how they're using the space to ensure that it is not causing loud noise or issues within the community. So, I'm trying to remember our exact criteria that we have. But we have a policy, a permit guidance that is provided online. But if you can give me a list of any of issues that may be happening at a particular site, I can look into it. But in general, there is, unless it's non-compliance with our board policy, and we ensure that they are addressing their space and cleaning up behind them, they generally may be able to get a permit to operate within our site.
Okay, I mean that's a fair answer. I guess my concern is, like, if we're committed to having a system of community schools, I don't want anybody to get the sense that having organizations in a school in a community is necessarily in any way related to that being a community-oriented use of the school. If the people aren't actually from that community, if it isn't serving something that meets needs of people in the immediate surrounding community. But I understand the logic of having just some basic criteria and an application and permit process. I probably also have personal feelings about propensity of churches using schools like this in general. Mr. Chair, do you have any other questions or anything? Okay, so I think we have two other members on here who haven't, maybe Councilman Burnett, do you have any other further questions?
I'm good, Mr. Chair.
And I think Council Members Porter and Conway, who are still both here with us at 9:30, but are not committee members, so kudos to you for being with us still. You have both had your questions answered. Councilmember Cohen, you got anything to wrap things up?
No, I'm good. Thank you, though.
Who feels like they just won a half hour of their life back as we wrap this up at 9:30 instead of 10 o'clock? I am gonna maybe extend my bike ride home in the dark a little ways because I have a light and I'll feel safe on these good cycle tracks that we have in the city. I want to just thank everybody for being here. Thank you, Marguerite, for being a champion throughout this week. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for organizing everything and for giving me the opportunity to sit in here as vice chair this evening. To Nina and to Matt and to everybody else. To Mira, thank you. We are in recess until Monday, June 7th at 9 a.m. First up will be the fire department. We're in recess. Thank you, everybody.